What is up, Dynasty fans? This is Levi, bringing you another episode of Data-Driven Dynasty, where we let the data speak for itself. We are going to run through all the important data surrounding Rome Odunze. We are not talking about hot takes, just reasonable projections, ranges of outcomes, and realistically where Rome Odunze should be being priced this season based on what he can do and his projected value next season. Our first episode, we did a player deep dive on Chase Brown, where we correctly predicted how the NFL draft would impact the Bengals backfield, as well as the impact on Chase Brown's price. And if you're interested in catching Chase Brown's player deep dive, you can head down to the description below to check it out. Now, let's take a look at Rome Odunze. For some background, Rome is currently valued as the last wide receiver before the wide receiver fall off in Dynasty startup drafts. Usually occurs around the fourth round after guys like Rashee Rice and T. Higgins, and then the other side of the wide receiver fall off, you have guys like Devontae Smith, Jordan Addison, Chris Olave, and Xavier Worthy. The two big questions that we're going to have to answer today are, one, is Rome going to emerge as the wide receiver one in Chicago? And two, the more important question is, what is the value of the wide receiver one in Chicago realistically going to be for this year and for years to come? So let's start with Rome's 2024 season. Rome played 17 games, 101 targets, 54 receptions, 734 receiving yards for 13.6 yards per reception, 18 red zone targets for only 3 touchdowns, 19% team target share, 552 routes run, an average depth of target of 13.8, a catchable target rate of 58.4%, 253 yards of yak, 1.33 yards per route run, and 8.5 fantasy points per game. And so with these statistics, there are some red flags and there are some green flags. We like to see a rookie that has a lot of targets. That means he got involved. However, he only hauled in 54 of those targets for receptions. Now, a lot of people will blame his catchable target rate, which was only 58.4%. But for a player with a 13.8 average depth of target, that's not an unrealistic number for that kind of a player. That stat is the catchable target rate is always lower for these players who are deeper targets, right? Who have a higher ADOT. And so if you look around the league, a 58.4% catchable target rate is honestly right about average. And so most people point to that as kind of a green flag, that he just had a low catchable target rate and that should come up. However, that number might actually be stickier than we would expect. So there's definitely some promising things in Rome Odunze's profile, but there's also some things that could be a little concerning. So let's take a look at some more stats. I really like to look at the advanced route running statistics because that really is indicative of a player that gets open and gets more opportunity, right? Who earns more targets. So looking at his route win rate, 52.7%. That's good for 17th in the league. His routes versus man, 41% win rate, good for 26th in the league. His routes versus zone, even better at 59.6%. And he had great target separation at 1.93 yards versus man and 2.95 yards versus zone. Actually, I lied to you. These are JSN's advanced route running statistics from his rookie season. So whenever we actually look at Rome Odunze's, his advanced route running statistics are much, much, much worse. His route win rate, only 37.5%, good for 98th in the league last year. His routes versus man, only 24.2% route win rate versus man, good for 103rd in the league. His routes versus zone, down at 46.6%. And his target separation numbers were not very good. 1.33 yards versus man and 2.39 yards versus zone. And so what we can see here is that at the very least, Rome Odunze is a very different type of wide receiver than JSN was. He is winning contested catch, getting catches downfield, but he has got to still get open in order to increase his target volume. And so while we look at, JSN's advanced route running metrics from his rookie year, he was pretty efficient and he was getting really good separation, which was indicative of him taking a jump in his second year. However, with Rome Odunze, his advanced route running metrics have him as one of the worst starting wide receivers in the league in terms of winning routes. The reason why I really wanted to compare JSN and Rome is because they are constantly being compared. Any conversation about Rome Odunze and what he's going to do in his second year comes back to, well, look what JSN did last year. So let's take a deeper look at exactly how JSN improved his production between years 1 and years 2. So the most important change that happened for JSN was an increase in opportunity, particularly in his team target share and in his routes run. And so his team target share went from 17% to 24%, and his routes run went from 471 to 617. And so if you take that roughly 30% increase in his target share and the 30% increase in his routes run, 40% increase in his target share, that gives you approximately the 15 points per game that JSN scored last year. It was a little higher, closer to 16, but approximately, if you just increased the opportunity statistics from 2023 to 2024, and you kept in his efficiency metrics from 2023, it got us to approximately his 2024 fantasy production. And so what we can see is that JSN got a little bit more efficient, 13% more efficient on a yards per reception basis. However, that's not a significant enough jump to get him from 8.8 points per game to 14.9 points per game, where the big difference came was his opportunity. And so the question for us is, can Rome Odunze do the same thing? Can he follow the same route? And so what can Rome really increase to increase his opportunity? So like we said, he had 552 routes run last year, which put him at 13th in the league of any wide receiver in 2024. And so, the number of routes run could always increase. The Bears could have even more dropbacks next year, especially with a Ben Johnson offense. However, it's even if the routes run increase, he's already so close to kind of the cap, so close to the maximum number of routes run for a wide receiver, that if you increase it that 8 to 10% to match the number one wide receiver in routes run last year, that's not really going to be enough to bump his production. And so what about the target share, right? And so at a 19% target share, Rome Odunze could increase that. That is absolutely reasonable. But again, he started out at after his rookie season, a higher team target share than JSN did. And with the additions made in the offseason, it's looking less likely that Rome Odunze's target share is going to be able to significantly increase this year. And so Rome Odunze is unlikely to follow the exact same path JSN did, because honestly, Rome Odunze had the opportunity during his rookie year. He had the routes run, he was on the field, and he had really a decent team target share, considering his surrounding cast. And so even if you max out those two values, it's not going to get you to 15 points per game like it did for JSN, because JSN started out with such a worse opportunity share. So what are the other areas where Rome Odunze could improve? So let's look at his catchable target rate. Now, like we already talked about, a higher ADOT player is just going to have a lower catchable target rate. There's no way to get around that. The farther you throw the ball, the less accurate it's going to be, the more defenders are going to be in between you and the ball, and the more time the quarterback has to get pressured and, not be able to make a super clean throw. And so a lower catchable target rate really is realistic for players like Rome Odunze, who had a 13.8% ADOT, 13.8 yard ADOT. So let's look at kind of the best and some of the more of the average catchable target rates for this type of player specifically. So the highest catchable target rating for a high ADOT player in 2024 came from Terry McLaurin, who had a similar ADOT at 13.3 yards, but his catchable target rate was all the way up at 74%, which shouldn't surprise anybody. Jaden Daniels was electric with his deep balls last year, and it's what made the Washington's offense so good. And really what turned the team around was that deep threat ability that made that whole offense more efficient and run smoother. And so there is absolutely room to grow in that catchable target rate. If Caleb Williams takes a step up in year 2, the offensive line is improved, it really is realistic for his catchable target rate to go up. But again, going from 58% to maybe 70% still isn't that big of a jump. Going from 58 to 70%, right? It's not going to be a night and day difference in runs production. So that is an area where he could improve maybe 15 to 20%. But again, he's starting from such a low fantasy production from his rookie year that his catchable target rate is unlikely to make a significant impact, because 58.4% is honestly right around, if not slightly above average for these high ADOT players. You look at guys like Alec Pierce, Rashid Shaheed, Demarcus Robinson, and their catchable target rates were closer to 50%, 50, 51, 49%. A more comparable player would probably be Marvin Harrison Jr., who also had a high ADOT, but was in the low 60s. And so there's definitely room to grow, but we also can't expect it to change dramatically because, again, these players who have high ADOTs just have high uncatchable target rates. Moving to yards per reception, this is a little bit of a cat and mouse game, because if we look at Rome, he's not a big yak threat. He wasn't in college. He didn't have a ton of yak last year. And so unless he really becomes a different type of wide receiver next year, I wouldn't expect his yards after the catch to increase by any significant amount. So if we want his yards per reception to increase, what would really need to increase is his depth of target. However, again, for the higher your ADOT, the lower your catchable target rate is going to be. And so I don't see him significantly increasing his yards per reception. And if he does, then that's likely because he's having a higher ADOT and thus a lower catchable target rate. And so any improvement in his yards per reception is likely to come with a knock in his catchable target rate. And then the last area where Rome could really improve, and I think the most likely for him to improve and have some positive regression, are touchdowns. He had those 18 red zone targets, really good, but again, he's got to be able to turn those 18 targets into more touchdowns. He only had 7 receptions off of those 18 red zone targets and only took 3 for touchdowns. So he absolutely underperformed given the red zone utilization. But at a certain point, right, you have to question whether or not it's a analytic anomaly, or if it has to do with something about the Bears offense with Caleb Williams, with Rome Odunze. Is there some disconnect there? And so this is absolutely a good place for Rome to have some increase in his fantasy production. However, if you take all 5 of those areas and you assume that Rome's going to hit a reasonable ceiling in all 5 of those areas, going to improve in all 5, then his ceiling realistically is still only 17 points per game. If every single one of those 5 areas hits and improves for Rome in 2025, unless he significantly improves as a player, increases his own efficiency, increases his route win rate and things like that, then he is really, really, really unlikely to have a ceiling higher than 17 points per game. Because of the type of player that he is, the high ADOT, the lower target volume, and the inefficiency that Rome had last season. And so a more realistic projection, if some of these things go right for Rome Odunze in 2025, but some of them, maybe don't get there, maybe some things go wrong for him, is more like 13 points per game, 12 to 13 points per game. And if we take the inverse and we say, what if things just go wrong for Rome? What if all of these areas are actually worse for him in 2025? Then we're looking at a floor closer to 7 points per game, which, for a player that is being drafted as highly as Rome is, I would really love to see a floor that's higher than 7 or 8 points per game. And, I know some of you are going to watch this and say 7 points per game, that's totally unrealistic. He's a great prospect. He's got a good offense. But look at what he did last year. He only had 8.5 points per game. And so, his floor is not safe by any means. It's because, it's realistic that one of these 2 rookies in Burden or Loveland could come in and could become that second receiving option. Rome could be pushed down to the 3rd receiving option. Or the targets and the fantasy points could just be so spread out between the run game and then the 4 or 5 different receiving threats that the Bears have that no one could score very highly. So this gets us back to the, how valuable is the wide receiver 1 in Chicago going to be? Because, we have wide receiver 1s in good offenses like the Baltimore Ravens with Zay Flowers or the Buffalo Bills with Khalil Shakir, where, even though they're the wide receiver 1 in that offense, they're still very capped because of everything else that's in the offense, all the other fantasy relevant assets that are getting touches. And so just because Rome has a chance to be the wide receiver 1 in Chicago, we can't assume that if he does become the wide receiver 1, that's going to significantly increase his fantasy value. Because at the end of the day, you got to score points in order to have fantasy value, right? To win people leagues. And if Rome is stuck around 12, 13, 14 points per game, then he's not gonna have a high ceiling. He's not gonna be a difference maker in fantasy football. So jumping down to thinking about JSN and what he needed to do in order to increase his fantasy production for the 2024 season, he really only needed 2 things to happen. He needed to take over Tyler Lockett for snaps and really be on the field more and run more routes. And he needed to increase his target share relative to the rest of the offense. And so, especially looking at JSN's efficiency and advanced metrics the year prior in his rookie year, both of these outcomes really could have been pretty expected because he was just a better wide receiver than Tyler Lockett, and he was so successful and efficient with the targets that he did get in 2023 that it made total sense for JSN to be getting the ball more. And so if we think about this like a sports bet, like a parlay, a 2-leg parlay, especially 2 things with pretty high odds of hitting, that's a pretty good bet, especially for the price that JSN was going at last year. So now let's try and think about a parlay for Rome to kind of hit his ceiling outcome, to really break out. And unfortunately, Rome's parlay is a bit longer than JSN's because JSN already had all the efficiency metrics. He was already doing really well on the field. He just needed more opportunity. However, for Rome had quite a bit of opportunity, especially for a rookie, and he just didn't turn that into production. And so there's actually 8 things on Rome Odunze's parlay. First, it's Rome himself taking a step forward as a player. Caleb Williams taking a step forward as a player next. DJ Moore taking a step back. Ben Johnson improving the entire Bears offense, right? Improving the offense in a way that benefits Rome instead of maybe benefiting the third or fourth option in the offense or benefiting the run game disproportionately. And so, Ben Johnson coming to the offense, it could definitely be a good thing for Rome Odunze, but it could also be a bad thing because what if Ben Johnson is just scheming up plays for Cole Kmet and Loveland and Burden and some of those other options in the offense and isn't scheming up as many plays for Rome Odunze? And so, again, it could be a good thing for Rome, it could be neutral, and it really, honestly, it could also be a bad thing. Burden, the next thing is Burden outperforming expectations. And so, if a rookie comes out and does better than expected, he could potentially take over as the wide receiver 1, the wide receiver 2 in that offense over Rome Odunze. And again, not saying that that's likely, but that's something that we have to take into account in the range of outcomes. And the same thing applies to Loveland. So that's 6. The seventh thing would be the run game. And, maybe the run game with the new offensive line just outperforms expectations. And, we can look at the Eagles, the Chiefs, run games that are performing really highly, performing efficiently, really limit the number of dropbacks for an offense, limiting the opportunity for the wide receivers. And so that's also something that we have to think about. And the last thing is that the Bears' defense could also overperform expectations. The Bears' defense really wasn't bad in 2024. One of the big problems was the lack of offense and giving the other team lots of opportunities. And so with a higher efficiency offense and maybe a better defense in 2025, the Bears could just not need to score that many points in games to win them. They could play at a slower pace, they could play more run heavy, and they could really limit the number of downs in the game overall. And so we really need all 8 of these things to go in Rome's way in order for him to hit that ceiling outcome of, let's say, maybe 17 to 18 points per game, right? And just every single one of them has to hit. And if one of them doesn't hit, it could really cost Rome in production. And so even assuming really good odds for each individual bet on this parlay, in order for all 8 of them to hit, it's only a 16% chance. For 7 out of 8 of them to hit, only a 20% chance, right? And it just keeps getting a little bit better incrementally as we go down. So a 26% chance of 6 of 8 of them to hit, and so on. And so whenever we stack up so many different things that need to happen, it's so easy for one of them to go wrong. And it becomes more and more difficult to really see all of these things lining up and happening perfectly. However, it could happen. This is within the range of outcomes. It's just not as likely as I would like it to be. So knowing this, let's talk about the price. So JSN during the 2024 offseason was going in the late 6th, early 7th round. This offseason, he's jumped up to the mid to late 3rd round. And so for JSN, that was a 3+ round jump in price. And fantasy value, it's not linear throughout the draft. And so trying to quantify that a little bit better, I'd say that JSN tripled in value, right? And so if you bet on JSN last offseason, he really paid off. He tripled your money, your hypothetical fantasy money. However, what I will say is that JSN and his mid to late third round price, he did not, or I should say JSN's production in 2024 did not earn him that third round dynasty startup pick value. The reason that JSN is being priced in that spot is because we are projecting him even further into the 2025 season. We think he'll do even better and that he has a much higher ceiling that we just haven't seen yet. And, that's exactly where he's being priced, is in that group of kind of unrealized upside players. He's right around Marvin Harrison Jr. and Garrett Wilson and Ladd McConkey. And so, I think that it's a very reasonable price for JSN. I think that, projecting him to have a higher ceiling, to be maybe a more difference-making fantasy asset for your dynasty teams moving forward is pretty realistic, because JSN had that blow-up game in Week 9 against the Rams where he scored 37 PPR points. And the reason that's significant is because that is one of the two games where Metcalf was out with an injury. JSN not only produced more, he was also running deeper routes and showing that he was not only a low ADOT threat, but that he could also penetrate deeper into the secondary and make plays. So now that Metcalf and Lockett are out of town, and his only real target competition is going to be, an old, recurrently injured Cooper Kupp, there are legitimate reasons to be really excited about JSN moving into next year. And so the point that we need to take from this is that not only does Rome have to hit that 14, 15, 16 points per game, he also would have to show that we could project him even further, that he has even a higher ceiling. Because 14, 15, 16 points per game, where, we might view that player as having a capped ceiling, well, that's someone like JSN or Devontae Smith, who are going, a full 2 rounds below JSN and a full round below Odunze. And so in order for Odunze to hit a similar price as JSN, Odunze is going to have to, break out, have a pretty good season, and then also show a higher ceiling. And the main way that Rome would, that this could happen for Rome is if DJ Moore was moved to another team. But Moore, just last year, received a huge 4-year, $110 million extension. And absolutely, there are trade rumors, especially with the addition of Burden and Loveland in the draft. But the way I see it, Ben Johnson really likes to have an assortment of weapons in his offenses. We can see that. We saw that with Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery, right? Everyone thought that they were going to move off of David Montgomery. However, the Lions have just kept using those two backs in tandem. And so he really likes having a ton of skill at the skill positions, per se. And so trade rumors are, they're always going to be there. But at the end of the day, they're just rumors. And most of the time, these rumors don't come true. And so, and within the range of outcomes, absolutely DJ Moore could be moved off of the team for another need that the team has, or some draft picks. However, I wouldn't say that it is the most likely outcome here, especially when we really haven't seen difference-making a wide receiver production from Luther Burden or Rome Odunze at this point. It would be a different story if Rome Odunze and Luther Burden had already come out and each had a breakout season where they showed, a lot of upside. However, we haven't had that yet. So the second problem the first problem there is that Rome is being valued really in a range where in that early to mid fourth, where if he just breaks out but doesn't show that he has a really high ceiling, then that is honestly probably where he should be valued. If he does have a breakout 14, 15, 16 point per game season, but doesn't have that increased ceiling heading into the next offseason. So the second problem is that Rome is simply too high to his value ceiling. So if JSN is Rome's value ceiling, just forgetting that entire first argument, then he barely has any room to rise in value. The quote-unquote buy-in for betting on Rome is 3 rounds of Dynasty startup value more expensive than it was for JSN last year. And because you have to buy in so much higher, the payoff for Rome at that price is minimal. Because if he hits and he is right next to where JSN is this year, next offseason, you only gained a round of value. So what you're doing is you're making a similar bet on Rome Odunze that you might have or you might not have last year for JSN. However, that bet is now twice as expensive and it pays off like less than half the reward, more like a third of the reward for that price. And it's all about price, right? Because if Rome Odunze was valued a little bit lower, then he would have more room to rise. One, it would be a lower buy-in, but it would also be a higher payoff if he did break out and if he did hit. And, if you're somebody who really, really believes that Rome Odunze is the truth and that he's going to break out next year and that he's going to increase in value, wouldn't you want to have a greater increase in value on your dynasty teams? So again, all about the price. And honestly, looking at the price that Rome Odunze is on underdog fantasy and best ball drafts, we can see that he's going around the wide receiver 40. And so taking him that early in a dynasty startup, but he's falling so late in underdog drafts, one of these two prices is not correct. One of these two prices is going to be wrong, because if he produces around the wide receiver 40 next year, would be like 11 or so points per game, then Rome is not going to pay off his dynasty price. And if Rome outproduces this underdog draft value and he's maybe a low to mid wide receiver 2, then he's being significantly undervalued in dynasty best ball drafts. And to be completely honest, Rome is somebody who should be pushed up in best ball drafts as a lower catch rate, higher yards per reception, and higher touchdown rate type of player. Not necessarily that he had the touchdowns last year, but that for his player profile, we would expect him to have more touchdowns. He's exactly the kind of player that you would want in a best ball half PPR format, because he can give you those huge spike weeks, especially relative to some of the other wide receivers who are limited by the 0.5 PPR. And so, again, one of those two prices is going to disappoint people, right? One of those prices is going to be very, very wrong. And one of the things that I really like to do is try and make my redraft takes make sense in the setting of my dynasty takes. And so, you can say that Rome is a young player, a good prospect, somebody who might not produce this year but could produce for you in future years. Well, Rome is going to be most likely going to be in the same situation for the next 2 to 3 years. And so if he can't produce this year, why would we expect him to then, progress and produce more in years to come, right? He could continue to develop as a player, but, so will Luther Burden and Colston Loveland and these other guys that are on the Bears offense and are going to be there for time to come, for some time. So where should Rome realistically be priced, considering his ceiling, his floor, and kind of that realistic projection for him in the 2025 NFL season? So really what is holding up Rome's price is that he was a great prospect. He had a great prospect profile coming out of college, and the fact that we weren't expecting him to produce in his rookie season. However, given the amount of opportunity that Rome had, especially considering that Keenan Allen had an injury early on in the season where he missed 2 games and was limited in a third, Rome had a ton of opportunity. And he really, really didn't show much that we could be optimistic about heading into the 2025 season. It's looking like Rome is going to have a pretty capped ceiling for the next couple of years. So even if he's able to come out and put up, again, like those 14, 15 points per game, that's not exactly difference-making fantasy production. And you can find that fantasy production in, young-ish players a lot cheaper in Dynasty startups right now. Guys like Jordan Addison and Devontae Smith, who scored 14 and 15 points last year, respectively. And so I would rather be drafting a person who has a more sure floor and I'm going to get more sure production from than somebody who also has a capped upside but has a much lower floor, as in Rome Odunze. And so I would rather have guys like Addison and Smith over Rome right now. And I also think I would like to have guys like Olave and Worthy, guys who have what I believe is much higher upside. Worthy being in the Chiefs offense, Olave being the clear number one with a new quarterback coming in. So Tyler Shuck could be a total bust, or he could be a decent quarterback, and we could see a huge bounce back season for Olave. Again, it's all a matter of price and balancing that upside and the downside, because Rome has a limited production upside, and he also has that low floor. And so where I would be more comfortable taking him is in the early to mid 6th round. And that's where I could see myself being excited to click on Rome. Because if he does have that breakout season, he actually has room to give you a decent value in. And on the other hand, if Rome is a bust, you're not having to give up the 4th, mid 4th, maybe even early 4th round price tag to go and get him. You're able to pay much less. And so if he disappoints in his year 2 and his price drops, then you're not out so much of your again, hypothetical fantasy dollars, right? And Rome really could fall very, very fast if in 2025, one of those two rookies comes out and establishes themselves as the number 2 receiving option in that offense. Rome gets beaten out and moved down to the 3rd receiving option, even if he's still getting decent volume and is producing those, maybe like 12 to 13 fantasy points per game. Just the fact that he's the 3rd option would cap his ceiling so much that I could see him being pushed down into that Josh Downs, Khalil Shakir range down in the 8th, 9th rounds. And so that, to me, is just a much better balance of his upside and his downside. And what it really feels like, going back to that parlay, is that we're just assuming that Rome is going to take a step forward, which does have a high likelihood, but again, it's not fact. We're assuming that Caleb Williams will take a step forward and that Ben Johnson will be beneficial to Rome and that the rookies won't take over Rome. And so whenever we're assuming all of these things that, while they do have a high likelihood of falling in Rome's favor, it takes just one of them to not fall in his favor in order to really cap his upside and to cap his production. And so I feel like this mental math that a lot of people are doing surrounding Rome Odunze right now is we're just assuming that all of these different things are going to line up for Rome because they're likely. But again, making those assumptions it's pushing him up boards and out of a range where I think that his price is reasonable. And so that is really all the data that I have on Rome Odunze right now and what a more accurate and reasonable price would be for him. And so if you enjoyed the video, then drop a like, leave a comment. I would love to hear, what you think of this analysis and this breakdown. Who do you think the wide receiver 1 in Chicago is going to be? And do you think that the wide receiver 1 in such a crowded receiving room can be a difference maker for your fantasy teams in 2025? So thank you all for listening, and I'll catch you next time.